Thank you for the kind introduction, and welcome to our session, Nothing But Stuffing, a holistic and thorough playbook for credential stuffing. I'm Sam Small, and I'm the Chief Security Officer at ZeroFox. I've spent my career in security, first as an academic, then as a consultant and advisor, and more recently, building security products and maintaining product security, and helping organizations deploy and operate those products within their own security programs. So why did I submit a proposal to the FS-ISAC to give a talk to you today about credential stuffing? I have a few reasons. First, like many of you, I had become frustrated with the sheer volume and pace of news stories about successful and large-scale attacks using credential stuffing against critical institutions, whether they be economic in nature or involved with our personal identity or our health and safety. Second, I was frustrated with the number of news stories that confused the details of credential stuffing with those of a data breach. And as many of you already know, those two things are not the same. And in fact, a data breach often precedes a credential stuffing attack. And third, and finally, I was a bit surprised that when, out of curiosity, I went to go looking for programmatic advice for educating, preventing, identifying, and responding to credential stuffing attacks, that there was little holistic or thorough guidance available. Instead, most of the advice offered to thwart credential stuffing recommends that we enable or implement a handful of relatively commonplace security controls or patronize a few services and products from different security market categories. And really, if that's all it took, credential stuffing wouldn't occupy nearly as much airtime or cost organizations as much money as it does today. So really what we're trying to do today is provide a brief overview and survey of credential stuffing and what it is, which many of you are probably already familiar with, and if not, we'll get you up to speed right away. And then we'll begin to talk about credential stuffing issues within your security program and how you might form a more broad and thorough strategy about addressing it from start to finish so that you can have a stronger defense capability if and when faced with this class of attack. And so before we begin, I'd like to briefly thank you for joining our session, and I'd ask that you please jot down or try to remember any questions you may have along the way, as I'll try to address them at the end of the session or via email if we run out of time. So as a brief overview, this is what you can come to expect from this presentation. First, we'll cover the current state of credential stuffing attacks. Next, we'll talk about understanding some of the risks, impacts, and costs in dealing with this threat. We'll move on to covering some of the best practices and guidance you're most likely to find when researching this topic. And we'll talk about some actual use cases and trends that we're seeing in this space and amongst this trend. Finally, we'll take a look at some research ideas on how to better address this threat to your organization and other pragmatic solutions that may help along the way. Okay, let's start at the very beginning. What is credential stuffing? I borrowed this definition from the kind folks at OWASP, and I've added a few words here and there to add a little more context or breadth where I thought it might be helpful. So, credential stuffing is the automated injection of breached username and password pairs in order to fraudulently gain access to user accounts. Large numbers of spilled credentials are automatically entered into websites, systems, or applications until they are potentially matched to an existing account. And once matched, the attacker can hijack this account for their own purposes. So this lies somewhere in a space that is more attractive to an attacker and more effective for an attacker than a straight up brute force attack or password guessing attack, but it's not quite as good as having known working credentials against another system. And really, this type of attack is very old in nature, with the idea being that if I was able to maybe dump a password database through SQL injection attack or something like that, that I could rely on the fact that many users have probably reused the same password that they used on that site that has been exploited as they would use on many of other sites that have some value to me as an attacker. And so that's really it. That's all credential stuffing is. It's people not following what is perhaps the most simple and easy piece of advice you can give in computer security, which is never reuse a password. And yet, it happens all the time, which leads to credential stuffing attacks being so prevalent and, I guess, worth the effort for attackers and a headache for organizations and security practitioners. And for those of you that are more visually inclined, I've also provided here a diagram of what a typical credential stuffing attack may look like and its anatomy. And I borrowed this figure from the kind folks at Auth0. So here you can see pretty much a visual depiction of what we just described. The only thing I would caution here that's slightly different in practice is this third step here, where we go from attacker to the acquisition or possession of compromised credentials to this botnet portion where those credentials are automatically and in a distributed manner tested amongst different systems, used to identify which victim sites may have accounts that use those same credentials. That third step, the botnet step, in more recent times has really become its own type of business. And so with the rise of malware as a service or crimeware or just cybercrime as a service in general, we find that this part actually gets farmed out a lot now. So you can take a person with an interest in having access to accounts that are not their own, that has very little technical skill or know-how. They can take a little bit of time or money or virtual currency. They can purchase exposed credentials, and then they can buy time or resources or services on some other cyber criminals' elastic, malicious compute cloud to do all the other work for them. And so combined with a phishing kit and credential stuffing as a service type options, what you essentially have today is a very low cost, effective, and in a sense, script kiddie of the modern times attack to have access to accounts from services of any type that an attacker may be interested in, whether it be a financial service, a gaming service, personal email targeting people of a certain demographic, etc., whatever you like. Now, normally when I talk about a topic or a trend, I don't like to just tell you that activity is increasing or the volume of a certain attack type is growing. Normally I like to try to provide some independent proof of that. So in this case, although I don't really believe in it when other researchers do it, I was just curious to see what Google Trends told us about the popularity or the volume of chatter around credential stuffing over time. And as you can see from this graphic, it certainly has grown, especially since the beginning of this particular timeline, which is around 2015. But it still doesn't make sense. Credential stuffing as a concept has been around for a long time, longer than I've been in security even, because I remember talking about the same type of attack back in the early days of my graduate school experiences. And so something sat wrong with me here when I was looking at this graphic, and I couldn't put my finger on it until I walked away and kind of chewed on it in the back of my mind. And eventually I realized, oh yeah, of course. I don't remember this being called credential stuffing except for maybe the last 5 or so years. And so as I went to go look up the origin of the phrase credential stuffing, that's exactly what I found. I found that credential stuffing as a term was coined in about 2011 and is attributed to one of the founders of Shape Security, which was then acquired by F5 Networks. And so what I've done here for you, because again, this type of attack's been around for a long time, is I presented some other names for this type of threat beyond credential stuffing, because prior to the popularity of this particular term, it may have been mentioned or referenced in some other way, and even since the introduction of the term, that might be the case as well. So if you're investigating this or looking for other thoughts or options or opinions on this topic, you might find this list helpful. And so coming full circle here a little bit, where I wanted to show you that credential stuffing attacks have increased in popularity and including some of that heritage from Shape Security and their founder. We have some data here from F5 Networks, which had acquired Shape Security, showing us exactly how prevalent credential and other brute force type attacks are in the enterprise and how that is growing over time. And so this isn't, indisputable proof, but again, this gives us a sense of the growing urgency of dealing with these types of threats. And so if you're looking for more information about credential stuffing attacks and you're trying to help reason or develop a calculus around cost and impacts and other best practices that your peers may be following, or that may inspire you to tackle some parts of this issue that you haven't been traditionally, these reports here may help you do that, as they've been useful to me in preparing this talk and thinking about the subject. So the DBIR report from Verizon, for instance, has some great information showing how and why it was necessary for them to reconfigure the way that they count and account for these types of attacks in their report, especially in contrast to other types of attacks. The credential stuffing report from F5 Labs that was released this year has some really interesting information about the trends as well. So for instance, they're able to show us that over the past several years, the number of credential stuffing attacks has increased dramatically. However, the number of spilled credentials in some has reduced dramatically as well. And while this explanation isn't given in the report, the reason I think this is happening is because you have a lot more software as a service in the enterprise space in the last 5 years or so. And so you have a lot of companies that are trying to get security right, but probably don't have the security staff and experience that a more established company would have. And likewise, you've taken probably what's a large user base across what would be traditionally like kind of monolithic winners of every category, and now people have a lot of options because of SaaS services in almost every market category. And so you end up with smaller user bases, but you end up with more companies providing those services that are vulnerable to credential stuffing. And then likewise, because we're here at FS-ISAC, you might be interested in Akamai's phishing for finance report, which also includes some information about credential stuffing that is interesting. In the US here, credential stuffing has become such a problem that we both have the SEC and the FBI releasing information to organizations and enterprises and financial institutions, warning them about the prevalence, the tactics, and the impacts of credential stuffing. And then I've saved some other recent reporting information for the end of the talk that I'm just teasing you with here, so you'll stick around. And so if you're responsible for defending against attacks, and in particular credential stuffing attacks in your organization, or you're interested in contributing to the effort, let's take a look at what some of our options are, as you might expect to see when you Google the topic or research the topic on your own. And so what I've done here is I've used OWASP's cheat sheet series guide for credential stuffing prevention to show the categories of options that they suggest. And in the first category, we have multi-factor authentication. Obviously, multi-factor authentication is going to be a great technique to defend against credential stuffing, because even if you know my password on another system, the way credential stuffing, or the way multi-factor authentication typically works, that is when a device that hasn't been seen before tries to authenticate with a username and a password, then that event will initiate a challenge with the second or more factors of authentication. And so then, unless an attacker also has access to or is able to phish you for that second factor, they're probably not going to be successful stuffing that service with a known invalid password for an account. Now, however, the one caveat here would be with SMS as a second factor, it is sometimes pretty non-trivial to either phish or eavesdrop on that channel of communication, especially when it comes to using like a SIM swapping attack, or again, if an attacker sends some sort of follow-up communication by email or calls someone on the phone and asks them to share that information. Likewise, I know that when I've talked to a number of security professionals and practitioners at consumer banks, they have remarked that multi-factor authentication isn't always a desirable feature to offer or to require for customers, because many of their customers can find multi-factor authentication either confusing or difficult to set up and use, which can lead to attrition and loss of customers to other banks with what seem like easier systems to use. In these other categories, namely alternative defenses and defensive depth, we also see another nice selection of options to use. However, again, all of these come with some sort of caveats depending on the context of your application or your system and services. And in addition to that, it can be difficult to deploy something like multi-factor authentication organization-wide because you've got different systems. Like you might have the login for all of your customers. You might have different API services that use either tokens or passwords and other types of operational and internal systems. And so it can be tough to blanket the entire enterprise in every type of system that you deal with. Clearly, the more you have an option like a single sign-on available to you, you might be able to have a choke point for multi-factor authentication. Like perhaps if you use Okta or something in that category, then that's something you could do. But again, I wouldn't say that any one of these controls or even 2 or 3 of these controls is going to do the job of programmatically defeating or defending against credential stuffing. There's more that we can do and frankly should do here. And briefly, let's talk about some of the common traps that people often encounter when attempting to put an end to credential stuffing attacks and threats in their organization. So first, as we talked about at the beginning of this talk, credential stuffing doesn't require a data breach. And that can be confusing to a lot of individuals, not necessarily security practitioners, but other individuals in your organization. And so it's important, I think, to help educate people about that early on or at the very latest at the time of facing these types of threats, whether they're successful or not. Because again, through a game of telephone, if you tell someone that there's been an increased risk in credential stuffing attacks, it could quickly turn into telling someone else that we're more likely to face a data breach or something like that. And again, it's not necessarily the case. Credential stuffing might lead to more account takeovers. It could lead to other types of threats like ransomware, et cetera, if you had a credential stuffing attack that overlapped with a significant portion of the accounts you have in a particular system. That could be effectively the same as a data breach, but that's not necessarily the case. Also, and as we just kind of hinted at, some organizations mount too shallow a defense against credential stuffing. They might turn on a control like multi-factor authentication, but maybe only for one of their systems, which represents just a portion or fraction of their potentially vulnerable systems. And likewise, they may use some other features that, again, at the end of the day, may reduce the potential impact slightly, but are going to, by and large, miss the general big boat of it all. Likewise, you can cast too narrow a net. Again, this is very similar to that last category, except this one's really more about breadth in terms of all of the, again, locations where a credential stuffing attack may affect the organization, rather than the depth, which may be about connecting the dots that one type of event has led to another, and drawing kind of that causal thread through the needle. And then finally, not coordinating data systems, teams, and analysis can also be a missed opportunity when trying to address credential stuffing. So for instance, if you're not combining your failed login attempt data, which may come from one team, with a kind of abnormal behavior logging or analysis on a system where someone actually is authenticated, or perhaps is exporting data or encrypting the hard drive or something like that. Again, you have these spaces where coordination falls between the cracks, and we miss an opportunity to identify either a particular type of event attack or even worse, perhaps an attack campaign. And so now let's take a look through the stuffing lens as we talk about program components, capabilities, roles, and responsibilities, as we take a broader system-wide view of credential stuffing within our security programs. Here, I've borrowed a slide from Microsoft about managing information in cyber risk, because I think as a placemat, it does a really good job of identifying all of the areas of a security program, whether they actually exist in your program or your organization, or whether they're just kind of aspirational needs or pieces that whether they exist formally or not, or at all, there still is some de facto notion of each part that you see here within most enterprises. And so even doing nothing in one of these areas, or not having someone or someone's responsible for one of these areas, is still a choice in and of itself, whether or not that choice is made explicitly or due to a lack of resources or maturity. Something is still done in every single one of these pieces in an organization, even if it's doing nothing at all. And this, I think, is really helpful when you start to look at credential stuffing and the seriousness of it, and how and where it can be really made into a program feature or a focus of your program. And so whether we're talking about management or leadership, and we're talking about maybe tabletop exercises, or talking about setting the agenda and the initiatives for new accomplishments and new capabilities, whether we're talking about user education, again, reminding people not to reuse passwords and what goes wrong when you do reuse a password, or how these types of attacks can be mitigated or responded to. There are a lot of opportunities here. Likewise, if we begin to look at some of the information around infrastructure and endpoint, we can start to think some of those places where we might have gaps between two teams or two different accounts of record in identifying and, again, showing the causal analysis or the causal inference between errors of one type and activity of another type, inferring that perhaps we're being targeted by a credential stuffing attack, or showing that an increase of activity in our web application firewall may be a good hint or precursor to an attack that's coming, or combining information from our cyber threat intelligence about new data breaches may give us early warning, especially if the credentials that were breached are known. We might be able to go ahead and do a cross-reference or analysis prior to the credential stuffing from that breach coming to our organization and its edge, and we might be able to either ask or encourage our users to change their password. We might force them to enroll in multi-factor authentication, or we might just force them to reset their password as well. There are a lot of options here, and again, if you get ahead of these things, and if it's not just one person or one team's responsibility, you can really coordinate a very good defensive approach here. And likewise, you can begin your incident response perhaps a lot sooner than you would otherwise, because now you're paying attention to more signals from more places. And frankly, you're just putting smarter people closer to each other and giving them a chance to work together in defeating something that could have a very large effect, not only within their organization, but with their customers and the greater organization as well. And so to further justify this idea that we should take a broader system or program-wide view of credential stuffing, I went and pulled up the table of contents for the CISO Desk Reference series. So there's 2 volumes, and right here we have the table of contents from both. This is a fantastic book if you're not familiar with it. It's a series of books, rather, and it's written by a few folks in our community who have done a fantastic job of putting their years of experience and expertise into these resources. I recommend checking it out if you're at all interested. But really, what I wanted to show here was if you look at the section titles for the entire series, as well as the chapter titles and themes, you can quickly see that this could almost form an outline for your holistic playbook within your organization to address credential stuffing, because it hits on every single aspect that we probably should address, from, again, kind of preparing ourselves to performing the recovery and cleanup and the communication afterwards, as well as even just communicating generally with others in our organization outside of the security function, whether they be peer organizations, whether they be users and employees, or whether you're talking up to management or the executive team or even the board. and taking an orthogonal view within your organization and within your program of the what of credential stuffing and the pieces and themes and responsibilities within your security program. We can also look at the security roles and responsibilities and start to think about who is going to handle and investigate or be responsible or report on any of the credential stuffing related issues we may be interested in or tasked with addressing and mitigating or preventing. And so this is another nice placemat I've borrowed from Microsoft that, again, I think can really help you start to tie many of those themes and requirements or pieces from the other placemat slide to who exactly is going to handle those things and what the kind of cycle is going to look like of operation and where collaboration and communication needs to occur. And again, it's okay if you can't satisfy or service all of these at the same time or today. I think there's nothing wrong with having a capability or a program roadmap that is very clear and honest about what we're able to cover today with the resources we have, what we hope to be able to cover at certain points in the future, whether it be by quarter or week or year, et cetera, and to help us identify where we need additional help or resources, whether that's going to come from additional hiring or whether it's going to come from service by way of a security product that we're going to license or buy, or through some sort of outsourced help or other type of managed service that may be able to help us address these issues faster than we could on our own. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, when I was describing my background, I am a bit of a recovering academic. And so one of the techniques I use when I'm researching a topic or trying to think about new ideas or find motivation as a practitioner or an advisor or consultant is to see what the latest research in any particular area is discussing, and maybe some new techniques or observations that come from academia have to tell us about things that we can do today in the enterprise at the kind of the operational edge of these issues rather than at the bleeding edge or the research edge of these issues. So as I looked at almost every academic paper published from the past few years touching on this topic, these 6 papers in particular, I found quite interesting or had some interesting ideas. And so I'm just going to briefly talk about some of them, and I encourage you to go check them out if you're interested in any more information around these research papers and their topics and their results. And so first we have this paper called Beyond Credential Stuffing, Password Similarity Models Using Neural Networks. And here really what the authors are trying to do is to say it has been seen that it's not enough when a user is creating or changing a password to simply require that they don't reuse a password. We also want to prevent them from using a password that is too similar or modeled after a previous password. And we've seen this in some systems. When we try to create a password, it might say it's too much like their existing password or a previous password, but those tend to be pretty simple heuristics in providing that analysis and things that we would think of as a natural successor to an older password might easily get by one of those detectors that isn't based so much on academic principle as the ideas presented in this paper. The next paper is called Protocols for Checking Compromised Credentials, and essentially here we run into an issue that a lot of you may have, which is, how do I report on compromised credentials and share that information with other organizations without revealing the credentials themselves? Because essentially you could be the secondary source of a leak or a credential breach by trying to do that. However, if you don't share that information, you may leave a lot of other organizations susceptible to credential stuffing from a breach of your own because they were not able to use that information to evaluate whether or not any of the passwords their users use, and those users being shared users between you, are susceptible to a forthcoming credential stuffing attack. Likewise, this paper by Wang et al., the detecting stuffing of a user's credentials at her own accounts, is a really cool idea, which is that you could somehow give power to the user. And so through some sort of federated system of different unrelated systems that have some sort of authentication component in them, say a Facebook and a bank account, there would be some sort of ability for the user to recognize among those multiple systems that there are maybe credential stuffing attempts, failed logins, or a reuse of an existing password from another system or a previous password from another system in one of these other partner systems. And so this is kind of a neat idea because it gives the power back to the user and maintains their privacy. It presents a method and a protocol for doing this where those disparate sites don't actually share the credential information itself with each other, and so the user has some control and visibility there. Now, obviously, that's not something you can probably roll out on your own, not without putting together some sort of real coalition or consortium, but it is a neat idea, and perhaps there are some ideas and methods there that could be used prior to kind of having all the wheels greased in order to achieve ultimately what's presented in that paper. The next paper, What Was That Site Doing With My Facebook Password, talks about how you design password reuse notifications. And so while I don't have a problem understanding password reuse notifications, and I'm sure none of you do in the audience either, I certainly have been in the company of my parents or family or friends when they encounter these types of notifications. And I will say a paper like this is very important and useful if you're responsible for delivering a product of any kind that has these notifications or wants to deliver these notifications, because I've seen these people be very confused and have a hard time understanding exactly what this notification means, what to do about it, and the so what of it all. In the paper, A Large-Scale Analysis of Attacker Activity in Compromised Enterprise Accounts, we can learn more about what people do after they have successfully stuffed your system. What kind of behavior can we expect next through that account takeover? And again, the possibilities are many, and we've talked about some of them that happen through account takeover, like ransomware or spamming other users and leveraging your access to a particular account to take advantage of the trust that someone might have coming from that particular account and its communication or its request for something. And so again, if you are trying to understand, how would credential stuffing affect me or my product or my business, or how can I maybe share some anecdotal or empirical evidence with a colleague or management to further justify our interest and attention to these issues, that might be a good resource for you. And then finally, how do people change their passwords after a breach, or do people change their passwords after a breach, is another perhaps frustrating look at what causes all of these issues to begin with, and really helps us understand what's likely in terms of our expectations on users once a password breach has been identified. Now, I've spoken with you today about most of the topics that I wanted to cover as far as it relates to holistically approaching the credential stuffing threat within your organization. But as I teased a little earlier, there's one more topic area that I wanted to cover briefly, and this may provide some additional leverage or motivation for your colleagues or management to buy into spending more time and effort and resources on addressing credential stuffing head-on and, again, more holistically. And so that is the topic of liability. And so what's happened in the past few years in a few different jurisdictions is really interesting. Typically, we're not too surprised when an organization is found somehow responsible for a data breach, whether it be through negligence or lack of notification or a lack of following best practices or standards or requirements, even when it comes to compliance and things like that. But what is a little more foreign to us is the idea that an organization would be directly held accountable or liable for the successful completion of a credential stuffing attack. So if that doesn't sound weird to you, then let's step back and think briefly about what's happening here. We have organization A having a data breach, and then organization B being attacked by someone who has access to those compromised credentials and having them used successfully against your system and services because a user you share in common reused a password. I will choose not to describe my opinion on that, although you can probably read it a little bit on my face. And don't get me wrong, I think organizations should be held accountable and should be responsible for security, but this is just an interesting area to think about, and this is an interesting development to see because it raises the bar. And if it becomes a legal requirement or effectively a requirement of an industry or an organization to detect credential stuffing attacks and prevent them with some level of service level expectation, then what follows is that there's very likely should be some sort of standard or baseline level of service requirement. And so while we see some of these organizations and these articles that I presented here demonstrating the expected responsibility and the liability for not preventing credential stuffing attacks, what we don't see in any of these jurisdictions, to my knowledge, is an explicit documentation of what that baseline exactly is. And so something's got to give here. I love standards when they're pragmatic and practical and meaningful and well stated. But I also don't love it when organizations and individuals are punished or are held accountable for expectations that aren't clearly expressed and shared. And so it's going to be interesting to watch this space and see what happens. Will more jurisdictions follow on, or will legislation be passed that kind of speaks to the requirements here? Will it become part of the standards that we use elsewhere? I don't know, but watch this space. And again, be aware that while protecting and defending against data breach attacks is important for a number of reasons, including the liability issues, this credential stuffing liability issue should be on someone's radar, probably within your organization. And with that, I want to thank you once again for attending our session, and I'd like to pause here to see if there are any questions from any of you, and I will be happy to answer them. If I don't get to your question now, I will do so by email, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the FS-ISAC event. Have a good day.